on the City Wall by Rudyard Kipling. Narrated by Robin Nixon. Then she let them down by a cord through the window, for her house was upon the town wall, and she dwelt upon the wall. Joshua 2:15. Lalun is a member of the most ancient profession in the world. Lilith was her very great-grandmama, and that was before the days of Eve, as everyone knows. In the West, people say rude things about Lalun's profession, and write lectures about it, and distribute the lectures to young persons in order that morality may be preserved. In the East, where the profession is hereditary, descending from mother to daughter, nobody writes lectures or takes any notice, and that is a distinct proof of the inability of the East to manage its own affairs. Lalun's real husband, for even ladies of Lalun's profession in the East must have husbands, was a big jujube tree. Her mamma, who had married a fig tree, spent 10,000 rupees on Lalun's wedding, which was blessed by 47 clergymen of Mama's church, and distributed 5,000 rupees in charity to the poor. And that was the custom of the land. The advantages of having a jujube tree for a husband are obvious. You cannot hurt his feelings, and he looks imposing. Lalun's husband stood on the plain outside the city walls, and Lalun's house was upon the east wall, facing the river. If you fell from the broad window seat, you dropped 30 feet sheer into the city ditch, but if you stayed where you should and looked forth, you saw all the cattle of the city being driven down to water, the students of the government college playing cricket, the high grass and trees that fringed the river bank, the great sandbars that ribbed the river, the red tombs of dead emperors beyond the river, and, very far away through the blue heat gaze, a glint of the snows of the Himalayas. Wali Dad used to lie in the window seat for hours at a time, watching this view. He was a young Mohammedan who was suffering acutely from education of the English variety, and knew it. His father had sent him to a mission school to get wisdom, and Wali Dad had absorbed more than ever his father or the missionaries intended he should. When his father died, Wali Dad was independent and spent 2 years experimenting with the creeds of the earth and reading books that are of no use to anybody. After he'd made an unsuccessful attempt to enter the Roman Catholic Church and the Presbyterian fold at the same time, the missionaries found him out and called him names, but they did not understand his trouble. He discovered Lalun on the city wall and became the most consistent of her few admirers. He possessed a head that English artists at home would rave over and paint amid impossible surroundings, a face that female novelists would use with delight through 900 pages. In reality, he was only a clean-bred young Mohammedan with penciled eyebrows, small cut nostrils, little feet and hands, and a very tired look in his eyes. By virtue of his 22 years, he had grown a neat black beard, which he stroked with pride and kept delicately scented. His life seemed to be divided between borrowing books from me and making love to Lalun in the window seat. He composed songs about her, and some of the songs are sung to this day in the city, from the street of the mutton butchers to the coppersmith's ward. One song, the prettiest of all, says that the beauty of Lalun was so great that it troubled the hearts of the British government and caused them to lose their peace of mind. This is the way the song is sung in the streets, but if you examine it carefully and know the key to the explanation, you will find that there are 3 puns in it on beauty, heart, and peace of mind, so that it runs, by the subtlety of Lalun, the administration of the government was troubled, and it lost such and such a man. When Wali Dad sings that song, his eyes glow like hot coals, and Lalun leans back among the cushions and throws bunches of jasmine buds at Wali Dad. But first, it is necessary to explain something about the supreme government, which is above all and below all and behind all. Gentlemen come from England, spend a few weeks in India, walk round this great sphinx of the plains, and write books upon its ways and its works, denouncing or praising it as their own ignorance prompts. Consequently, all the world knows how the supreme government conducts itself, but no one, not even the supreme government, knows everything about the administration of the empire. Year by year, England sends out fresh drafts for the first fighting line, which is officially called the Indian Civil Service. These die or kill themselves by overwork, or are worried to death or broken in health and hope in order that the land may be protected from death and sickness, famine and war, and may eventually become capable of standing alone. It will never stand alone, but the idea is a pretty one, and men are willing to die for it, and yearly the work of pushing and coaxing and scolding and petting the country into good living goes forward. If an advance be made, all credit is given to the native, while the Englishmen stand back and wipe their foreheads. If a failure occurs, the Englishmen step forward and take the blame. Overmuch tenderness of this kind has bred a strong belief among many natives that the native is capable of administering the country, and many devout Englishmen believe this also, because the theory is stated in beautiful English with all the latest political colour. There be other men who, though uneducated, see visions and dream dreams, and they, too, hope to administer the country in their own way, that is to say, with a garnish of red sauce. Such men must exist among 200 million people, and if they are not attended to, may cause trouble, and even break the great idol called Pax Britannic, which, as the newspapers say, lives between Peshawar and Cape Comorin. Were the day of doom to dawn tomorrow, you would find the Supreme Government taking measures to allay popular excitement, and putting guards upon the graveyards that the dead might troop forth orderly. The youngest civilian would arrest Gabriel on his own responsibility if the Archangel should not produce a Deputy Commissioner's permission to make music or other noises, as the licence says. Whence it is easy to see that mere men of the flesh who would create a tumult must fare badly at the hands of the Supreme Government, and they do. There is no outward sign of excitement, there is no confusion, there is no knowledge. When due and sufficient reasons have been given, weighed and approved, the machinery moves forward, and the dreamer of dreams and the seer of visions is gone from his friends and following. He enjoys the hospitality of government. There is no restriction upon his movements within certain limits, but he must not confer any more with his brother dreamers. Once in every 6 months, the Supreme Government assures itself that he is well and takes formal acknowledgement of his existence. No one protests against his detention because the few people who know about it are in deadly fear of seeming to know him, and never a single newspaper takes up his case or organises demonstrations on his behalf, because the newspapers of India have got behind that lying proverb which says the pen is mightier than the sword and can walk delicately. So now you know as much as you ought about Wali Dad, the educational mixture, and the Supreme Government. Laloon has not as yet been described. She would need, so Wali Dad says, 1,000 pens of gold and ink scented with musk. She has been variously compared to the moon, the Dil Sagar Lake, a spotted quail, a gazelle, the son of the desert of Kutch, the dawn, the stars, and the young bamboo. These comparisons imply that she is beautiful exceedingly according to the native standards, which are practically the same as those of the West. Her eyes are black, and her hair is black, and her eyebrows are black as leeches. Her mouth is tiny and says witty things. Her hands are tiny and have saved much money. Her feet are tiny and have trodden on the naked huts of many men. But, as Wali Dad sings, Laloon is Laloon, and when you have said that, you have only come to the beginnings of knowledge. The little house on the city wall was just big enough to hold Laloon and her maid, and a pussycat with a silver collar. A big pink and blue cut-glass chandelier hung from the ceiling of the reception room. A petty Nawab had given Laloon the horror, and she kept it for politeness' sake. The floor of the room was of polished tunum, white as curds. A latticed window of carved wood was set in one wall. There was a profusion of squabby, pluffy cushions and fat carpets everywhere. And Laloon's silver haka, studded with turquoises, had a special little carpet all to its shining self. Wali Dad was nearly as permanent a fixture as the chandelier. As I have said, he lay in the window seat and meditated on life and death and Laloon, especially Laloon. The feet of the young men of the city tended to her doorways and then retired, for Laloun was a particular maiden, slow of speech, reserved of mind, and not in the least inclined to orgies, which were nearly certain to end in strife. "If I am of no value, I am unworthy of this honour," said Laloun. "If I am of value, they are unworthy of me." And that was a crooked sentence. In the long nights of latter April and May, all the city seemed to assemble in Laloun's little white room to smoke and to talk. Shears of the grimmest and most uncompromising persuasion, Sufis who had lost all belief in the Prophet and retained but little in God, wandering Hindu priests passing southward on their way to the Central India fairs and other affairs, pundits in black gowns with spectacles on their noses and undigested wisdom in their insides, bearded headmen of the wards, Sikhs with all the details of the latest ecclesiastical scandal in the Golden Temple, red-eyed priests from beyond the border, looking like trapped wolves and talking like ravens, M.A.s of the university, very superior and very voluble. All these people, and more also, you might find in the White Room. Wali Dad lay in the window seat and listened to the talk. "It is Laloun's salon," said Wali Dad to me, "and it is electric. It is not that word? Outside of a Freemason's lodge, I have never seen such gatherings. There I dined once with a Jew, a Yahudi." He spat into the city ditch with apologies for allowing national feelings to overcome him. "Though I have lost every belief in the world," said he, "and try to be proud of my losing, I cannot help hating a Jew. Laloun admits no Jews here." "But what in the world do all these men do?" I asked. "The curse of our country," said Wali Dad. "They talk. It is like the Athenians, always hearing and telling some new thing. Ask the Pearl, and she will show you how much she knows of the news of the city and the province. Laloun knows everything." "Laloun," I said at random. She was talking to a gentleman of the Kurd persuasion who had come in from God knows where. "When does the 175th Regiment go to Agra?" "It does not go at all," said Laloun, without turning her head. "They have ordered the 118th to go to its stead. That regiment goes to Lucknow in 3 months, unless they give a fresh order." "That is so," said Wali Dad, with a shade of doubt. "Can you, with your telegrams and your newspapers, do better? Always hearing and telling some new thing." He went on. "My friend, has your God ever smitten a European nation for gossiping in the bazaars? India has gossiped for centuries, always standing in the bazaars until the soldiers go by. Therefore, you are here today instead of starving in your own country, and I am not a Mohammedan. I am a product, a damnation product. That also I owe to you and yours, that I cannot make an end to my sentence without quoting from your authors." He pulled at the hookah and mourned, half feelingly, half in earnest, for the shattered hopes of his youth. Wali Dad was always mourning over something or other, the country of which he despaired, or the creed in which he had lost faith, or the life of the English which he could by no means understand. Laloun never mourned. She played little songs on the sitar, and to hear her sing "O Peacock, Cry Again" was always a fresh pleasure. She knew all the songs that have ever been sung, from the war songs of the South that make the old men angry with the young men, and the young men angry with the state, to the love songs of the North, where the swords whinny wicker like angry kites in the pauses between the kisses, and the passes fill with armed men, and the lover is torn from his beloved and cries, "Aye, aye, aye," evermore. She knew how to make up tobacco for the hookah, so that it smelled like the gates of paradise, and wafted you gently through them. She could embroider strange things in gold and silver, and dance softly with the moonlight when it came in at the window. Also, she knew the hearts of men and the heart of the city, and whose wives were faithful and whose untrue, and more of the secrets of the government offices than are good to be set down in this place. Naziban, her maid, said that her jewellery was worth £10,000, and that some night a thief would enter and murder her for its possession. But Laloun said that all the city would tear that thief limb from limb, and that he, whoever he was, knew it. So she took her sitar and sat in the window seat and sang a song of old days that had been sung by a girl of her profession in an armed camp on the eve of a great battle, the day before the fords of the Jumna ran red, and Sivaji fled 50 miles to Delhi with a talk stallion at his horse's tail, and another Laloun on his saddle bow. It was what men call a Maharata Leonie, and it said, "Their warrior forces Chimnaji before the Peshwa led. The children of the sun and fire behind him turned and fled." And the chorus said, "With them there fought who ride so free, with sword and turban red, the warrior youth who earns his fee at peril of his head." "At peril of his head," said Wali Dad in English to me. "Thanks to your government, all our heads are protected, and with the educational facilities at my command," his eyes twinkled wickedly, "I might be a distinguished member of the local administration. Perhaps in time I might even be a member of a legislative council." "Don't speak English," said Lalun, bending over her sitar afresh. The chorus went out from the city wall to the blackened wall of Fort Amara, which dominates the city. No man knows the precise extent of Fort Amara. 3 kings built it hundreds of years ago, and they say that there are miles of underground rooms beneath its walls. It is peopled with many ghosts, a detachment of garrison artillery, and a company of infantry. In its prime, it held 10,000 men and filled its ditches with corpses. "At peril of his head," sang Lalun again and again. Ahead moved on one of the ramparts, the grey head of an old man, and a voice rough as sharkskin on a sword hilt sent back the last line of the chorus and broke into a song that I could not understand, though Lalun and Wali Dad listened intently. "What is it?" I asked. "Who is it?" "A consistent man," said Wali Dad. "He fought you in 46 when he was a warrior youth. He fought you in 57, and he tried to fight you in 71, but you had learned the trick of blowing men from guns too well. Now he is old, but he would still fight if he could." "Is he a Wahhabi then? Why should he answer to a Maharata Leonie if he be Wahhabi or Sikh?" said I. "I do not know," said Wali Dad. "He has lost perhaps his religion. Perhaps he wishes to be a king. Perhaps he is a king. I do not know his name." "That is a lie, Wali Dad. If you know his career, you must know his name." "That is quite true. I belong to a nation of liars. I would rather not tell you his name. Think for yourself." Lalun finished her song, pointed to the fort, and said simply, "Kem Singh." Said Wali Dad. "If the Pearl chooses to tell you, the Pearl is a fool." I translated to Lalun, who laughed. "I choose to tell what I choose to tell. They kept Kem Singh in Burma," said she. "They kept him there for many years, until his mind was changed in him. So great was the kindness of the government. Finding this, they sent him back to his own country, that he might look upon it before he died. He is an old man, but when he looks upon his country, his memory will come. And moreover, there be many who remember him." "He is an interesting survival," said Wali Dad, pulling at the hukka. "He returns to a country now full of educational and political reform, but as the Pearl says, there are many who remember him. He was once a great man. There will never be any more great men in India. They will all, when they are boys, go whoring after strange gods, and they will become citizens, fellow citizens, illustrious fellow citizens. What is it that the native papers call them?" Wali Dad seemed to be in a very bad temper. Lalun looked out of the window and smiled into the dust haze. I went away thinking about Kem Singh, who had once made history with 1,000 followers and would have been a princeling but for the power of the supreme government aforesaid. The senior captain commanding Fort Amara was away on leave, but the subaltern, his deputy, drifted down to the club, where I found him and inquired of him whether it was really true that a political prisoner had been added to the attractions of the fort. The subaltern explained at great length, for this was the first time that he had held command of the fort, and his glory lay heavy upon him. "Yes," said he, "a man was sent in to me about a week ago from down the line, a thorough gentleman whoever he is. Of course, I did all I could for him. He had his 2 servants and some silver cooking pots, and he looked for all the world like a native officer. I called him Subadar Sahib, just as well to be on the safe side, you know. 'Look here, Subadar Sahib,' I said, 'you're handed over to my authority, and I'm supposed to guard you. Now, I don't want to make your life hard, but you must make things easy for me. All the fort is at your disposal, from the flagstaff to the dry ditch, and I shall be happy to entertain you in any way I can. But you mustn't take advantage of it. Give me your word that you won't try to escape, Subadar Sahib, and I'll give you my word that you shall have no heavy guard put over you.' I thought the best way of getting him was by going at him straight, and it was by Jove. The old man gave me his word, and moved about the fort as contented as a sick crow. He's a rummy chap, always asking to be told where he is, and what the buildings about him are. I had to sign a slip of blue paper when he turned up, acknowledging receipt of his body and all that, and I'm responsible, that he doesn't get away. A queer thing, though, looking after a Johnny old enough to be a grandfather, isn't it? Come to the fort one of these days and see him. For reasons which will appear, I never went to the fort while Kipling was then within its walls. I knew him only as a grey head seen from Lallan's window. A grey head and a harsh voice. But natives told me that day by day, as he looked upon the fair lands round Amara, his memory came back to him, and with it the old hatred against the government that had been nearly effaced in far-off Burma. So he raged up and down the west face of the fort from morning till noon, and from evening till the night, devising vain things in his heart, and croaking war songs when Lallan sang on the city wall. As he grew more acquainted with the subaltern, he unburdened his old heart of some of the passions that had whispered it. "Sahib," he used to say, tapping his stick against the parapet, "when I was a young man, I was one of the 20,000 horsemen who came out of the city and rode round the plain here. Sahib, I was a leader of 100, and then of 1,000, and then of 5,000, and now—" He pointed to his two servants. "But from the beginning to today, I would cut the throats of all the sahibs in the land if I could. Hold me fast, sahib, lest I get away and return to those who had followed me. I forgot them when I was in Burma, but now that I am in my own country again, I remember everything." "Do you remember that you've given me your honour not to make your tendance a hard matter?" said the subaltern. "Yes, to you only, to you," said Kipling. "To you, because you are of a pleasant countenance. If my turn comes again, sahib, I will not hang you nor cut your throat." "Thank you," said the subaltern gravely, as he looked along the line of guns that could pound the city to powder in half an hour. "Let us go into our own quarters, Kipling. Come and talk with me after dinner." Kipling would sit on his own cushion at the subaltern's feet, drinking heavy, scented anise seed brandy in great gulps, and telling strange stories of Fort Amara, which had been a palace in the old days, of begums and rannies tortured to death, aye, in the very vaulted chamber that now served as a mess-room. Would tell stories of Sobrayan that made the subaltern's cheeks flush and tingle with pride of race, and of the Kuka rising, from which so much was expected, and the foreknowledge of which was shared by 100,000 souls. But he never told tales of 57, because, as he said, he was the subaltern's guest, and 57 is a year that no man, black or white, cares to speak of. Once only, when the anise seed brandy had slightly affected his head, he said, "Sahib, speaking now of a matter which lay between Sobrayan and the affair of the cookers, it was ever a wonder to us that you stayed your hand at all, and that, having stayed it, you did not make the land one prison. And now I hear from without that you do great honour to all men of our country, and by your own hands are destroying the terror of your name, which is your strong rock and defence. This is a foolish thing. Will oil and water mix, now, in 57? "I was not born then, Subadar Sahib," said the subaltern, and Kipling reeled to his quarters. The subaltern would tell me of these conversations at the club, and my desire to see Kipling increased. But Rudyard, sitting in the window seat of the house on the city wall, said that it would be a cruel thing to do, and Lallan pretended that I preferred the society of a grizzled old Sikh to hers. "Here is tobacco, here is talk, here are many friends and all the news of the city, and above all, here is myself. I will tell you stories and sing you songs, and Rudyard will talk of his English nonsense in your ears. Is that worse than watching the caged animal yonder? Go tomorrow then, if you must, but today, such and such, and one will be here, and he will speak of wonderful things." It happened that tomorrow never came, and the warm heat of the latter rains gave place to the chill of early October, almost before I was aware of the flight of the year. The captain commanding the fort returned from leave and took over the charge of Kipling according to the laws of seniority. The captain was not a nice man. He called all natives niggers, which, besides being extreme bad form, shows gross ignorance. "What's the use of telling off two Tommies to watch that old nigger?" said he. I fancy it soothes the vanity, said the subaltern. The men are ordered to keep well out of his way, but he takes them as tribute to his importance, poor old wretch. I won't have linemen taking off regular guards in this way. Put on a couple of native infantry. Sikhs, said the subaltern, lifting his eyebrows. Sikhs, Pathans, Dogras, they're all alike, these black vermin. And the captain talked to Kipling in a manner which hurt that old gentleman's feelings. 15 years before, when he had been caught for the second time, everyone looked upon him as a sort of tiger. He liked being regarded in this light, but he forgot the world goes forward in 15 years, and many subalterns are promoted to captaincies. The Captain Pig is in charge of the fort, said Kipling to his native guard every morning, and the native guard said, Yes, Subadar Sahib, in deference to his age and his air of distinction, but they did not know who he was. In those days, the gathering in Lalun's little white room was always large and talked more than before. The Greeks, said Rudyard, who had been borrowing my books, the inhabitants of the city of Athens, where they were always hearing and telling some new thing, rigorously secluded their women, who were fools, hence the glorious institution of the heterodox women, is it not, who are amusing and not fools. All the Greek philosophers delighted in their company. Tell me, friend, how it goes now in Greece and the other places upon the continent of Europe. Are your womenfolk also fools? Rudyard, I said, you never speak to us about your womenfolk, and we never speak about ours too. That is a bar between us. Yes, said Rudyard, it is curious to think that our common meeting place should be here, in the house of a common... how do you call her? He pointed with the pipe mouth to Lalun. Lalun is nothing but Lalun, I said, and that was perfectly true. But if you took your place in the world, Rudyard, and gave up dreaming dreams, I might wear an English coat and trouser. I might be a leading Mohammedan pleader. I might be received even at the commissioners' tennis parties, where the English stand on one side and the natives on the other, in order to promote social intercourse throughout the empire. Heart, said he to Lalun quickly. The Sahib says that I ought to quit you. The Sahib is always talking stupid talk, returned Lalun with a laugh. In this house I am a queen, and thou art a king. The Sahib... She put her arms above her head and thought for a moment. The Sahib shall be our vizier, thine and mine, Rudyard, because he has said that thou shouldst leave me. Rudyard laughed immoderately, and I laughed too. Be it so, said he. My friend, are you willing to take this lucrative government appointment? Lalun, what shall his pay be? But Lalun began to sing, and for the rest of the time there was no hope of getting a sensible answer from her or Rudyard. When the one stopped, and the other began to quote Persian poetry with a triple pun in every other line, some of it was not strictly proper, but it was all very funny, and it only came to an end when a fat person in black with gold pince-nez sent up his name to Lalun, and Rudyard dragged me into the twinkling night to walk in a big rose garden and talk heresies about religion and governments and a man's career in life. The Moharram, the great mourning festival of the Mohammedans, was close at hand, and the things that Rudyard said about religious fanaticism would have secured his expulsion from the loosest-thinking Muslim sect. There were the rose bushes around us, the stars above us. From every quarter of the city came the boom of the big Moharram drums. You must know that the city is divided in fairly equal proportions between the Hindus and the Mussulmans, and where both creeds belong to the fighting races, a big religious festival gives ample chance for trouble. When they can, that is to say, when the authorities are weak enough to allow it, the Hindus do their best to arrange some minor feast day of their own in time to clash with the period of general mourning for the martyrs Hassan and Hussein, the heroes of the Moharram. Gilt and painted paper presentations of their tombs are borne with shouting and wailing, music, torches and yells through the principal thoroughfares of the city, which fragments are called taziyas. Their passage is rigorously laid down beforehand by the police, and detachments of police accompany each taziyas, lest the Hindus should throw bricks at it, and the peace of the Queen and the heads of her loyal subjects should thereby be broken. Moharram time in a fighting town means anxiety to all the officials because, if a riot breaks out, the officials and not the rioters are held responsible. The former must foresee everything, and while not making their precautions ridiculously elaborate, must see that they are at least adequate. Listen to the drums, said Rudyard. That is the heart of the people, empty and making much noise. How think you will the Moharram go this year? I think there will be trouble. he turned down a side street and left me alone with the stars and a sleepy police patrol. Then I went to bed and dreamed that Rudyard had sacked the city and I was made vizier with Lalun's silver hookah for mark of office. All day the Moharram drums beat in the city, and all day deputations of tearful Hindu gentlemen besieged the Deputy Commissioner with assurances that they would be murdered and next dawning by the Mohammedans, which, said the Deputy Commissioner, in confidence to the head of police, is a pretty fair indication that the Hindus are going to make themselves unpleasant. I think we can arrange a little surprise for them. I've given the heads of both creeds fair warning. If they choose to disregard it, so much the worse for them. There was a large gathering in Lalun's house that night, but of men that I have never seen before, if I except the fat gentleman in black with the gold pince-nez. Rudyard lay in the window seat, more bitterly scornful of his faith and its manifestations than I had ever known him. Lalun's maid was very busy cutting up and mixing tobacco for the guests. We could hear the thunder of the drums as the processions accompanying each tazia marched to the central gathering place in the plain outside the city, preparatory to their triumphant re-entry and circuit within the walls. All the streets seemed ablaze with torches, and only Fort Amara was black and silent. When the noise of the drums ceased, no one in the White Room spoke for a time. "The first tazia has moved off," said Rudyard, looking to the plain. "This is very early," said the man with the pince-nez. "It is only 8:30. The company rose and departed. "Some of them were men from Ladakh," said Lalun, when the last had gone. "They brought me brick-tea, such as the Russians sell, and a tea-urn from Peshawar. Show me now how the English mem-sahibs make tea." The brick-tea was abominable. When it was finished, Rudyard suggested going into the streets. "I am nearly sure that there will be trouble tonight," he said. "All the city thinks so, and vox populi is vox dei, as the Babus say. Now I tell you that at the corner of Pajashi Gate you will find my horse all this night, if you want to go about and see things. It is a most disgraceful exhibition. Where is the pleasure of saying, 'Ya Hassan, Ya Hussein,' 20,000 times in a night?" All the processions, there were 22 of them, were now well within the city walls. The drums were beating afresh, the crowd were howling, "Ya Hassan, Ya Hussein," and beating their breasts. The brass bands were playing their loudest, and at every corner where space allowed, Mohammedan preachers were telling the lamentable story of the death of the martyrs. It was impossible to move, except with the crowd, for the streets were not more than 20 feet wide. In the Hindu quarters, the shutters of all the shops were up and cross-barred. As the first tazia, a gorgeous erection 10 feet high, was borne aloft on the shoulders of a score of stout men into the semi-darkness of the Gully of the Horsemen, a brickbat crashed through its talc and tinsel sides. "Into thy hands, O Lord," murmured Rudyard profanely, as a yell went up from behind, and a native officer of police jammed his horse through the crowd. Another brickbat followed, and the tazia staggered and swayed where it had stopped. "Go on. In the name of the circa, go forward," shouted the policeman. But there was an ugly cracking and splintering of shutters, and the crowd halted with oaths and growlings before the house whence the brickbat had been thrown. And then, without any warning, broke the storm, not only in the Gully of the Horsemen, but in half a dozen other places. The tazirs rocked like ships at sea. The long pole torches dipped and rose round them, while the men shouted, "The Hindus are dishonouring the tazirs! Strike, strike, into their temples for the faith!" The 6 or 8 policemen with each tazir drew their batons and struck as long as they could in the hope of forcing the mob forward, but they were overpowered, and as contingents of Hindus poured through the streets, the fight became general. Half a mile away, where the tazirs were yet untouched, the drums and the shrieks of "Ya Hassan, Ya Hussein" continued, but not for long. The priests at the corners of the streets knocked the legs from the bedsteads that supported their pulpits and smote for the faith, while stones fell from the silent houses upon friend and foe, and the packed streets bellowed, "Din, din, din!" A tazir caught fire, and was dropped for a flaming barrier between Hindu and Mussulman at the corner of the gully. Then the crowd surged forward, and Rudyard drew me close to the stone pillar of a well. "It was intended from the beginning," he shouted in my ear, with more heat than blank unbelief should be guilty of. "The bricks were carried up to the houses beforehand. These swine of Hindus, they shall be gutting kine in their temples tonight." Tazir after tazir, some burning, others torn to pieces, hurried past us, and the mob with them, howling, shrieking, and striking at the house doors in their flight. At last we saw the reason of the rush. Hugonin, the Assistant District Superintendent of Police, a boy of 20, had got together 30 constables and was forcing the crowd through the streets. His old grey police horse showed no sign of uneasiness as it was spurred breast on into the crowd, and the long dog whip with which he had armed himself was never still. "They know we haven't enough police to hold 'em," he cried, and as he passed me, mopping a cut on his face, "They know we haven't. Aren't any of the men from the club coming down to help? Get on, you sons of burned fathers!" The dog whip cracked across the writhing backs, and the constables smote afresh with baton and gun butt. With these passed the lights and the shouting, and Walidad began to swear under his breath. From Fort Amara shot up a single rocket, then two, side by side. It was the signal for troops. Pettit, the Deputy Commissioner, covered with dust and sweat, but calm and gently smiling, cantered up the clean-swept street in rear of the main body of the rioters. "No one killed yet," he shouted. "I'll keep 'em on the run till dawn. Don't let 'em hold Hugonin. Trot 'em about till the troops come." The science of the defence lay solely in keeping the mob on the move. If they had breathing space, they would halt and fire a house, and then the work of restoring order would be more difficult, to say the least of it. Flames have the same effect on a crowd as blood has on a wild beast. Word had reached the club, and men in evening dress were beginning to show themselves and lend a hand in heading off and breaking up the shouting masses with stirrup leathers, whips, or chance-found staves. They were not very often attacked, for the rioters had sense enough to know that the death of a European would not mean one hanging, but many, and possibly the appearance of the thrice-dreaded artillery. The clamour in the city redoubled. The Hindus had descended into the streets in real earnest, and ere long the mob returned. It was a strange sight. There were no tazirs, only their riven platforms, and there were no police. Here and there, a city dignitary, Hindu or Mohammedan, was vainly imploring his co-religionists to keep quiet and behave themselves, advice for which his white beard was pulled. Then a native officer of police, unhorsed, but still using his spurs with effect, would be borne along, warning all the crowd of the danger of insulting the government. Everywhere, men struck aimlessly with sticks, grasping each other by the throat, howling and foaming with rage, or beat with their bare hands on the doors of the houses. "It is a lucky thing that they are fighting with natural weapons," I said to Walidad, "else we should have half the city killed." I turned as I spoke and looked at his face. His nostrils were distended, his eyes were fixed, and he was smiting himself softly on the breast. The crowd poured by with renewed riot, a gang of Mussulmans hard-pressed by some 100 Hindu fanatics. Walidad left my side with an oath, and shouting, "Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein," plunged into the thick of the fight, where I lost sight of him. I fled by a side alley to the Bajashi gate, where I found Walidad's house, and thence rode to the fort. Once outside the city wall, the tumult sank to a dull roar, very impressive under the stars, and reflecting great credit on the 50,000 angry, able-bodied men who were making it. The troops, who, at the Deputy Commissioner's insistence, had been ordered to rendezvous quietly near the fort, showed no signs of being impressed. 2 companies of native infantry, a squadron of native cavalry, and a company of British infantry were kicking their heels in the shadow of the east face, waiting for orders to march in. I am sorry to say that they were all pleased, unholily pleased, at the chance of what they called a little fun. The senior officers, to be sure, grumbled at having been kept out of bed, and the English troops pretended to be sulky. But there was joy in the hearts of all the subalterns, and whispers ran up and down the line. "No ball cartridge! Oh, what a beastly shame! Do you think the beggars will really stand up to us? I hope I shall meet my moneylender there. I owe him more than I can afford. Oh, won't they let us even unsheathe swords? Hurrah! Up goes the 4th rocket. Fall in there." The garrison artillery, who, to the last, cherished a wild hope that they might be allowed to bombard the city at 100 yards range, lined the parapet above the east gateway and cheered themselves hoarse as the British infantry doubled along the road to the main gate of the city. The cavalry cantered on to the Pajashi gate, and the native infantry marched slowly to the gate of the butchers. The surprise was intended to be of a distinctly unpleasant nature, and to come on top of the defeat of the police, who had been just able to keep the Mohammedans from firing the houses of a few leading Hindus. The bulk of the riot lay in the north and northwest wards. The east and southeast were by this time dark and silent, and I rode hastily to Lalun's house, for I wished to tell her to send someone in search of Rudyard. The house was unlighted, but the door was open, and I climbed upstairs in the darkness. One small lamp in the white room showed Lalun and her maid leaning half out of the window, breathing heavily, and evidently pulling at something that refused to come. "Thou art late, very late," gasped Lalun, without turning her head. "Help us now, O fool, if thou hast not spent thy strength howling among the Tazirs. Pull, Nasiban and I can do no more. Oh, Sahib, is it you? The Hindus have been hunting an old Mohammedan round the ditch with clubs. If they find him again, they will kill him. Help us to pull him up." I put my hands to the long red silk waistcloth that was hanging out of the window, and we three pulled and pulled with all the strength at our command. There was something very heavy at the end, and it swore in an unknown tongue as it kicked against the city wall. "Pull, oh, pull," said Lalun at the last. A pair of brown hands grasped the windowsill, and a venerable Mohammedan tumbled upon the floor very much out of breath. His jaws were tied up, his turban had fallen over one eye, and he was dusty and angry. Lalun hid her face in her hands for an instant and said something about Rudyard that I could not catch. Then, to my extreme gratification, she threw her arms around my neck and murmured pretty things. I was in no haste to stop her, and Nasiban, being a handmaiden of tact, turned to the big jewel chest that stands in the corner of the white room and rummaged among the contents. The Mohammedan sat on the floor and glared. "One service more, Sahib, since thou hast come so opportunely," said Lalun. "Wilt thou—" It is very nice to be thou'd by Lalun. "Take this old man across the city. The troops are everywhere, and they might hurt him, for he is old, to the Kamhasan gate. There I think he may find a carriage to take him to his house. He is a friend of mine, and thou art more than a friend. Therefore I ask this." Nasiban bent over the man, tucked something into his belt, and I raised him up and led him into the streets. In crossing from the east to the west of the city, there was no chance of avoiding the troops and the crowd. Long before I reached the gully of the horsemen, I heard the shouts of the British infantry crying cheeringly, "Hut, you beggars! Hut, you devils! Get along! Go forward there!" Then followed the ringing of rifle butts and shrieks of pain. The troops were banging the bare toes of the mob with their gun butts, for not a bayonet had been fixed. My companion mumbled and jabbered as we walked on, until we were carried back by the crowd and had to force our way to the troops. I caught him by the wrist and felt a bangle there, the iron bangle of the Sikhs, but I had no suspicions, for Lalun had only 10 minutes before put her arms around me. Thrice we were carried back by the crowd, and when we made our way past the British infantry, it was to meet the Sikh cavalry, driving another mob before them with the butts of their lances. "What are these dogs?" said the old man. "Sikhs of the cavalry, father," I said, and we edged our way up the line of horses to abreast, and found the deputy commissioner, his helmet smashed on his head, surrounded by a knot of men who had come down from the club as amateur constables and had helped the police mightily. "We'll keep him on the run till dawn," said Pettit. "Who's your villainous friend?" I had only time to say, "The protection of the circa," when a fresh crowd flying before the native infantry carried us 100 yards nearer to the Kamhasan gate, and Pettit was swept away like a shadow. "I do not know. I cannot see. This is all new to me," moaned my companion. "How many troops are there in the city?" "Perhaps 500, I said. "A lac of men beaten by 500, and 6 among them. Surely, I am an old man, but the Kamhasan gate is new. Who pulled down the stone lions? Where is the conduit? Sahib, I am a very old man, and alas, I cannot stand." He dropped in the shadow of the Kamhasan gate, where there was no disturbance. A fat gentleman wearing gold pince-nez came out of the darkness. "You are most kind to bring my old friend," he said suavely. "He is a landholder of Akala. He should not be in a big city where there is religious excitement. But I have a carriage here. You are quite truly kind. Will you help me to put him in the carriage? It is very late." We bundled the old man into a hired Victoria that stood close to the gate, and I turned back to the house on the city wall. The troops were driving the people to and fro, while the police shouted, "To your houses! Get to your houses!" and the dog whip of the assistant district superintendent cracked remorselessly. Terror-stricken bunniers clung to the stirrups of the cavalry, crying that their houses had been robbed, which was a lie, and the burly Sikh horseman patted them on the shoulder and bade them to return to those houses lest worse things should happen. Parties of 5 or 6 British soldiers joining arms swept down the side gullies, their rifles on their backs, stamping with shouting and song upon the toes of Hindu and Mussulman. Never was religious enthusiasm more systematically squashed, and never were poor breakers of the peace more utterly weary and footsore. They were routed out of holes and corners, from behind well pillars and byres, and bidden to go to their houses. If they had no houses to go to, so much the worse for their toes. On returning to Lallan's door, I stumbled over a man at the threshold. He was sobbing hysterically, and his arms flapped like the wings of a goose. It was Wali Dad, agnostic and unbeliever, shoeless, turbanless, and frothing at the mouth. The flesh on his chest bruised and bleeding from the vehemence with which he had smitten himself. A broken torch handle lay by his side, and his quivering lips murmured, "Ya Hassan! Ya Hussein!" As I stooped over him, I pushed him a few steps up the staircase, threw a pebble at Lalun's city window, and hurried home. Most of the streets were very still, and the cold wind that comes before the dawn whistled down them. In the centre of the square of the mosque, a man was bending over a corpse. The skull had been smashed in by gunbutt or bamboo stave. "It is expedient that one man should die for the people," said Pettit grimly, raising the shapeless head. "These brutes were beginning to show their teeth too much." And from afar we could hear the soldiers singing, "Two lovely black eyes," as they drove the remnant of the rioters within doors. Of course, you can guess what happened. I was not so clever. When the news went abroad that Kem Singh had escaped from the fort, I did not, since I was then living this story, not writing it, connect myself, or Laloon, or the fat gentleman of the gold pince-nez with his disappearance. Nor did it strike me that Wali Dad was the man who should have convoyed himself across the city, or that Laloon's arms round my neck were put there to hide the money that Nasiban gave to Kem Singh, and that Laloon had used me and my white face as even a better safeguard than Wali Dad, who proved himself so untrustworthy. All that I knew at the time was that when Fort Amara was taken up with the riots, Kem Singh profited by the confusion to get away, and that his 2 Sikh guards also escaped. But later on I received full enlightenment, and so did Kem Singh. He fled to those who knew him in the old days, but many of them were dead, and more were changed, and all knew something of the wrath of the government. He went to the young men, where the glamour of his name had passed away, and they were entering native regiments of government offices, and Kem Singh could give them neither pension, decorations, nor influence, nothing but a glorious death with their backs to the mouth of a gun. He wrote letters and made promises, and the letters fell into bad hands, and a wholly insignificant subordinate officer of police tracked them down and gained promotion thereby. Moreover, Kem Singh was old, and aniseed brandy was scarce, and he had left his silver cooking pots in Fort Amara with his nice warm bedding, and the gentleman with the gold pince-nez was told by those who had employed him that Kem Singh, as a popular leader, was not worth the money paid. "Great is the mercy of these fools of English," said Kem Singh when the situation was put before him. "I will go back to Fort Amara of my own free will, and gain honour, and give me good clothes to return in." So, at his own time, Kem Singh knocked at the wicket gate of the fort, and walked to the captain of the subaltern, who were nearly grey-headed on account of correspondence that daily arrived from Simla, marked "Private." "I have come back, Captain Sahib," said Kem Singh. "Put no more guards over me. It is no good out yonder." A week later, I saw him for the first time, to my knowledge, and he made as though there were an understanding between us. "It was well done, Sahib," said he, "and greatly I admired your astutness in thus boldly facing the troops when I, whom they would have doubtless torn to pieces, was with you. Now, there is a man in Fort Udgar whom a bold man could with ease help to escape. This is the position of the fort, as I draw it in the sand." But I was thinking how I had become Laloon's vizier, after all.